All right, well, I'm going to go ahead and start. We had both Libby and Jeremy, Libby Roderick, who is going to be the moderator, and Jeremy Pataki, who put this together and is the sponsor. Both of them had medical emergencies and are not with us tonight. So please forgive this for being maybe a little bumpy. But I'm going to try to fill in some of what Libby was going to do for us here. So this is Women Writing the Natural World, and I welcome all of you to it. It's part of Alaska Book Week 2020. Jeremy Pataki, the founder of the new Porphyry Press, is the event sponsor, but he was unable to attend due to a family emergency. All four of us women on this panel, myself, Marybeth Holleman, Corinna Cook, Nancy Lord, and Adrienne. Adrienne, are you still here? Okay. Good, sorry. Have been devoted much of our writing careers to explorations of the natural world. And so we're going to reflect on the impact of the natural world, the more than human world, on our writing and our lives. To start off, what we're going to do is each of us are going to read a couple minutes of some of our new work and then reflect on what it shows about how time in the natural world guides our writing and how the more than human world influences our use of language and form. We'll take about 15 minutes for this question, and then we'll stop and do a little Q&A. Is that correct, Corinna? We're going to do a little Q&A right after this one?
I think we were expecting to do a Q&A during the last roughly quarter hour.
Okay, so at the end.
We are very excited to dialogue with you all, you beautiful audience. So please do ask us your questions in the chat, and we are saving time for that.
Okay. All right, so we'll do our part, and then we'll have the Q&A at the end, and we'll hopefully we'll stick around and answer everyone's questions or comments. And thanks everyone for coming. It's great to see so many folks that I know and so many folks I don't online here with us tonight. The first question will be answered by Corinna and Adrienne. So I'm going to introduce both of them, and I'm going to give the question, and then you guys can each speak. Corinna Cook was born and raised in Juneau. Her debut essay collection, Leave Takings, comes out in November next month with University of Alaska Press. Corinna's new work focuses on the cross-border ecologies, histories, and contemporary arts of the Yukon Territory and Alaska. Adrienne Lindholm, her memoir, It Happened Like This, A Life in Alaska, is a female-driven outdoor narrative which details her inspirational experience as a transplant to Alaska and beginning a career in environmental studies. Initially as a backcountry ranger in Denali, yearning to unlock the secrets of Alaska wilderness, and now, years later, overseeing the complex National Park Service Wilderness Stewardship Program in Alaska. She's inspired by wild, unhindered places, the flash of wonder in her daughter's eyes, and passionate friends and strangers who work to create a more compassionate and just world. So Corinna and Adrienne, the question for you. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm jumping around here. I'm going to ask each of you, first of all, to read a couple minutes of your work and then reflect on what it shows about time in the natural world. And then Nancy Lord and I will follow. So perhaps we can start with Adrienne.
Sure, thanks, and hello everyone. I tend to write personal essays and memoir, and my current project is a memoir about grief and resiliency. When I lost the dearest person in my life, her name is Avery, I wasn't sure how I could go on. And over time, I came to realize that being able to cultivate a sense of wonder allowed me to re-engage with life again. So I'm going to read you a real short passage from that work. When the sun was as high as it was going to get in November, when it only skims the horizon, JT and I drove to a wide, braided, frozen river that turns through an even wider valley. Snow-drenched peaks lined both sides. We clipped long ice skates onto ski boots and glided out onto the ice. The temperature hovered around 0 as we skated along creeks and sloughs. Everything felt stiff. My ski boots, air bubbles trapped beneath the ice, styrofoam snow along the banks, ice-crusted trees and blades of marsh grass frozen in place, my ice-crusted mitts, my heart caged beneath brittle ribs. For hours, we didn't see another person, only bear and fox prints on the snow-dusted ice. I caught myself smiling and feeling guilty. No, I corrected myself. Remember, it's okay to smile. Avery would want me to feel happy again. As we skated back toward the car, the sun began its slow descent, streaking the sky pink and orange. Frost grew on the ice in huge, flaky ice flowers, and our skates carved straight lines right through them. Avery, I called to her, do you see this? The glacier tumbled down to rest on the river bar. Pink light faded from the snowy peaks, and then it was once again so dim I could barely see across the lake. The first stars emerged in the sky, and the ice flowers twinkled under my skates. With ice blossoms glinting like stars at my toes, how could I not keep going? And I'll comment on that a little bit. Outdoor experiences are the sharpest for me. So they're just easiest to write about. And descriptions of place tend to anchor really all of my stories, because it seems for me I have the most clarity when I'm engaged in an outdoor activity, whether it's something like adventure skating, which is the activity that I was describing in that passage, or climbing a big mountain, or navigating a river. And with that clarity, I find that I can drill down deeper into the emotions that underlie that experience. And I think for me, that allows me to better connect with my audience. There's certainly a risk in revealing these really personal stories, but I also think that's what it takes to be authentic and connect with people. And I think people appreciate personal stories because at the end of the day, our emotions are universal. And when I write about these types of experiences like I did in my current memoir, It Happened Like This, about being a young woman coming to Alaska from Philadelphia and wondering if I was enough and wondering how I could belong and trying to find meaning and purpose for my life and really finding a compass in the natural world. It's a really revealing book, which is tough for me. And also, I think that's the strength of memoir and personal essay. So I guess the bottom line for me is this anchor to nature, to the natural world, really allows me to approach my work in a raw and honest and vulnerable way. And I think that helps me connect with the life experiences of other people. Thanks, Marybeth.
Thanks, Adrienne. Corinna?
Yeah, thank you, Adrienne. And thank you, Marybeth, for stepping into the moderating role. And all of you, Marybeth, Nancy, Adrienne, it's really special to be here with you. I will start out by saying, here's my new book. It's called Leave Takings. It's a collection of lyric essays, and University of Alaska Press will hold a digital launch event for it on November 25. Of course, I would truly love to see you all there. I'll pop a link with general book details into the chat, and you can circle back to it for reference later. What I'm going to read to you today is an excerpt from a new essay in progress that I'm calling Distance Over Light. And this piece will come out all by itself a year from now as an essay chapbook with our event sponsor, Porphyry Press. So I'd also invite you to watch the Porphyry Press website for details. Distance Over Light is an essay that begins with Douglas Island in Southeast Alaska, which the essay calls repeatedly the tear-shaped island on which I grew up. So if you can hold Juneau's topography in mind, that steep, sharp, rainforested coastal biome, that's the narrator's frame of reference. Helpful if you can hold it in mind, because what I'm going to read to you actually comes from later in the essay and takes place in Kansas. A sudden and an immediate thank you to poet Leanna Petronella, who is a totally irreplaceable reader for me, and she's weighed into this piece. Wouldn't be the same without you. All right, you'll hear echoes of the larger essay's main questions in this excerpt. Those questions are: how can the land tell us where we are? And where do my own reference points diverge from those of others who share this same land? Okay, from smack in the middle of Distance Over Light. The first time I crossed southern Kansas, I went east to west on Highway 50, or perhaps 54, and thought all day of the tall grass prairie and the Plains Indians, though present day agriculture somewhat eclipses both. Still, I tried to throw my mind underneath the industry at Kansas's surface. I thought of people who knew how to find their way on that wide land pressed right into the sky. People who knew how to find water, find animals, find their neighbors, find home. That is, all day, I watched the land's flatness, dizzying, and thought of people who knew right where they were. All day, I tried to understand where I was too. I tried to imagine finding my own way on the prairie. All day, I failed. I was stumped in several dimensions at once, stumped by the sheer scope of Kansas's industrial agriculture, stumped by the history of America's stupendous land grab, and stumped by the simple fact of flat topography, a shape I never learned to read. But the second time I set out to cross southern Kansas, west to east this time, I realized the land is not flat, it tilts. The first clue, I found Kansas's air was thinner at its western edge. My own body told me that. First, my lungs, then, of course, my heart. But it is not only the fact that Kansas tilts, it is the fact that from east to west, Kansas tilts about the same distance into the sky as does the tear-shaped island in Alaska from which I came. More even, more. I'm saying from tideline to the top of the peak we call Jumbo, my mountainous Fiordlands Island is like Kansas on edge. I'm saying from the Flint Hills across the whole prairie, Kansas is Douglas Island disguised as a table. My quick comment about that is that once the narrator recognizes her frame of reference, which simply put is just elevation gain, once she recognizes that playing out across the 400-mile expanse of the prairie, that prairie can become a kind of guide. And it opens up a difficult line of sight. Specifically, the narrator reads that Kansas casts aside its indigenous history like a severed limb, writes William Least Heat Moon. But just as the coincidental math of elevation gain echoes between these two distant places, so might their human histories, which leads the narrator to a particular silence around Douglas Island's history. And so this essay explores a similarly severed limb, you could say. In other words, the prairie adds clarity to my understanding of the tear-shaped island on which I grew up, and that's how the out of doors figures into my work. It speaks truth to power, or more precisely, the land speaks difficult insight to established habits of mind. Thanks.
Thank you, Corinna. So that will be out in another year or so, your essay that you're reading from. Lovely. Thank you. We're going to next hear from Nancy Lord, and then I'll go last. Nancy Lord was the Alaska State Writer Laureate from 2008 to 2010. She's the author of 3 short story collections, 5 books of literary nonfiction, including Beluga Days, Tracking a White Whale's Truths, and Early Warming, Crisis and Response in the Climate Change North, and the 2017 novel, pH. She also edited the anthology Made of Salmon. Her work, which focuses mainly on environmental and marine issues, has appeared widely in journals and anthologies and has been honored with fellowships and awards. She teaches science writing for Johns Hopkins University and is a regular and very much treasured book reviewer for the Anchorage Daily News. Nancy, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, thank you, Marybeth, for that and for stepping in, and I'm happy to be here with my colleagues, and I'm amazed at how many people have shown up for this tonight, so thank you all. Yeah, my writing related to the natural world really has to do with the marine world and coastal Alaska, and I've lived here in Homer all my adult life and spent a lot of time, I fished in Upper Cook Inlets, so I spent a lot of time on the beach there in the past and spend a lot of time on Kachemak Bay now. So I'm going to read from the middle of an unpublished essay that I wrote a year ago in October from one of my favorite places across the bay from Homer here. And this is just a few paragraphs from the middle of it. And I won't even think it has a name, I'm not sure. Despite all that is right in the natural world, I'm troubled by what is not. The summer's drought, which led to water shortages in nearby villages, and a wildfire that burned for months and closed off a major highway. The leafless, stick-bare blueberry bushes, more dead, broken spruce trees, killed by more bark beetles after the aphid attacks that sucked the juice from needles, and the jellyfish. Behind me on the beach lies a tide line of stranded jellyfish strung out like an archipelago. There are hundreds. Many are as large as platters, their colors deep red, purple, yellow, brown, and white. They washed up the day before on a higher storm tide and now are drying out, collapsing over the stones beneath them, glazing like melted plastic. Yesterday, they were beautiful, such ornate architecture with symmetries of line and pattern, colors pale and bright. Their translucent bells shielded globular and feathery masses of reproductive parts and strands of tentacles. Some I recognize as sea nettles, but others I have never seen before. What I know about jellyfish: they are, of course, not fish at all, but gelatinous zooplankton. They have a short lifespan, usually only a few months as adults, the medusa form of bell and tentacle. They've lived in our oceans for at least 500 million years and are remarkably resilient. They have been understudied by scientists because they lack commercial value, and yet they may play key roles in ocean ecosystems as well as contributing to biomedical research. And this, an increase in jellyfish blooms globally has scientists concerned. Jellyfish resilience makes them well adapted to changing ocean conditions that stress other species. Specifically, they not only survive, but can rapidly multiply in warmer, more acidic, and less oxygenated conditions. So thank you for that. Back to you, Marybeth.
Thank you, Nancy. That was lovely. So I'll introduce myself and read a little bit. Raised in North Carolina's Smokies, I transplanted to Alaska's Chugach Mountains after falling head over heels for Prince William Sound just 2 years before the Exxon Valdez oil spill. I'm author of The Heart of the Sound, co-author of Among Wolves, and co-editor with Anne Corey of Cross Currents North, among others. My first poetry collection, Tender Gravity, is forthcoming from Red Hen Press. I've held artist residencies at places including Ninfa, Mesa Refuge, Denali National Park, and Tracy Arm Ford's Terror Wilderness. And the short piece I'm going to read to you tonight is from an essay from that artist residency in Ford's Terror, or Tracy Arm Ford's Terror Wilderness. But first, let me say that I'm speaking to you from Anchorage, Alaska, on the lands of the Dena'ina people, and I am grateful for their caretaking of this beautiful place. So this essay that I'm going to be reading a short piece from just came out in this new journal, which everyone that writes about the natural world wants to know about, because it's called Deep Wild Journal. And they only accept pieces about places that it takes you at least a day away from a road to get to. So I think that's kind of cool. This essay, more than ever, first appeared in the journal Minding Nature of the Center for Human and Nature, and then Deep Wild Journal, I revised it some and they reprinted it. My artist residency was through the Voices of the Wilderness program, which again, all of you should know about. It's an excellent program, and I know Nancy's done several of them as well. And so I got to go as a writer with the photographer Irene Owsley to this incredible wilderness. And in this scene, we are paddling with the wilderness ranger, Solon Jensen, from Tracy Bar back across the bay to our base camp. On the paddle back, a raft of scoters scatter at our approach, black singing butterflies on a white canvas. The splashdowns of breaching whales boom off the mountainsides. Then one whale surfaces so near that my heart begins to pound. Bundled in several layers against the 50-degree chill, I suddenly get very warm. Irene, Solon, and I move closer, and I think about what our little kayaks must look like to a 40-ton whale, some slender pieces of driftwood. Solon says they know we're here and won't surface beneath us. That does not still my racing heart. 3 humpbacks circle us as they feed, surfacing on either side. One surfaces so close to Irene that she could have stuck out her paddle and touched it. We look at each other, eyes wide. Then one surfaces right next to me, a paddle length away, and my heart leaps into my throat, lodged like a stick in the whale's mouth, the one Jonah used to make his way out. The 2 go down, and then all 3 whales surface in unison, moving away from us. I feel small and insignificant. Despite Solon's assurances that the whales won't hit our boats, a few days after returning home, I read about a whale breaching on top of a sailboat in Southeast Alaska, sinking the boat as the 2 boaters clung to a floating ice chest. What would we have clung to had a whale breached on our kayaks, breaking all 3 like toothpicks? Still, through my hard beating heart, what I feel more than anything is safe. Safe in this wilderness where we're put into proper scale. Here in the bay, in the fog, in our small yellow kayaks on a still sea. Here with whales all around us, I feel that safety of scale, like the surf scoters or the marbled muralets, small and held in the place, as if our human concerns and transgressions have shrunk, as if there's still a place where we can go and be forgiven. So this idea of scale comes up a lot in my work. I talked about it in my book, The Heart of the Sound, too. And I get so much from spending time in the more than human world, and that insight that I feel safer that when humans are put in proper scale is really important, I think, because it's a reminder of what could be in our relation with the natural world. And this essay, the form of the essay is, of course, the trip experience, but I came to it with this question that I gnaw on throughout the whole essay and approach in different ways. And that is, what does wilderness mean now in this time of great planetary change, when there is no place left on Earth that is untrammeled? And that's the term from the Wilderness Act. Wilderness is untrammeled land. And see, what does that even mean anymore? And all of this, the way that I approach the writing really has to do with why I write. And I write to give voice to the more than human world. I came to writing from environmental sciences, and I'm constantly trying to step aside and let the natural world have the stage. So sometimes when I'm doing it right, it's more of a collaborative process. And so when I say that I'm writing something that has to do with an animal, I say I'm writing with animals, or I'm writing with this place rather than about this place. And sometimes when it really works, and then I'm really happy, it feels like I'm really just a translator. I'm just translating. That's my goal. So thanks for listening. And now I'll put my hat as moderator back on, and we will move into the next section, which is going to be a couple of questions. The first question is for Adrienne and Corinna will answer. And then the second question, Nancy and I will answer. This first one is, most authors in the literary genre described as nature writing are white people from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. Why might that be true for this genre? Why might it be true for wilderness adventuring in general? How do you think that impacts the type of writing in the genre? So, Corinna, shall we start with you?
Yeah, thank you. I'm really eager to talk about race and how I use writing to think through whiteness, particularly whiteness in North America. But this question also asks about race in the context of nature writing. So I want to speak to that first, because nature writing is a specific field. Not all writing from nature. And Marybeth, I love what you were saying, writing with a place in contrast to writing about a place. Not all writing with a place is nature writing. So I'll just say a little bit more about that. Nature writing thrives in the Victorian era. It's influenced by Enlightenment thinking, specifically the thought that human and nature are separate categories. And that's actually a really radical idea, because it's not in the scope of humanity. It's not necessarily normal to think of human and nature as two coherent and different categories. But it is very Western to think that way. And historically, it's led certain almost exclusively white man thinkers, but some white women thinkers also. But historically, it's led a number of thinkers to write about so-called like unpeopled wilderness and the pristine wild, very romantically, and to do it in no small part with really good intentions, right, with the purpose of protecting unpeopled wilderness from people. And the paradox there, of course, so the paradox of the field of nature writing is that in order for land to be unpeopled, its people have to have been removed. And we have a very significant history of that in North America. And it's marked our literary legacy because North America has produced a fair amount of literature that celebrates and seeks to preserve unpeopled wilderness. So we often look at Silent Spring. We talk about Rachel Carson as a kind of a turning point in this body of literature. And maybe the approximate, it's up for debate, but maybe the approximate end of nature writing, because what exists overwhelmingly today are environmental and eco literatures that address North America's legacies of genocide and slavery, and that probe the paradox of public land conservation on one hand, but only elite access on the other. These are literatures that really interrogate climate change, and specifically our complicity in climate change, and that more in mass extinction, and also really interrogate our complicity in the very extinctions that we mourn. So of those eco-literary topics, I participate most actively in conversations about North America's colonization and how to bear the truly shared burden, I would say, of that history. And I participate in conversations about the truly radical environmental upheaval that makes community cooperation so very, very important right now. So through the lens of race, well, this is the premise of my current book project. I'm in roughly year 3 of writing an essay collection about Yukon Territory and Alaska. What's really pressing to me in that project is to find ways for North American white people or settler in-migrants to help carry the burden of colonial trauma. And to me, that involves learning a lot of history and looking for plural perspectives on it. And I'd say the main way that I grapple with whiteness on the page is by writing about history. I love what Jill Lepore writes. She says, Jill Lepore writes, "The past is an inheritance, a gift, and a burden. It can't be shirked. You carry it everywhere. There's nothing for it but to get to know it." Well, one of the most stable characteristics of privilege is that when you have it, you don't see it. And so that's one of the reasons that I write persistently and repeatedly about whiteness, is because I want more people in my community, and in this case, I mean the white community. I want more people to see it, and I want us to see it with more and more nuance. And my thinking about this, it's quite inspired by feminism, and particularly how well the Me Too movement has done to get this particular message out. This is the Me Too movement. They've just done a great job at getting the message out that men, it's on you, that you have to hold one another accountable. We are not in your locker rooms. That's your work. So I really take that to heart, and that's how I see my whiteness as a writer. It's my responsibility to try to raise the bar in my own community. So I write about cross-cultural themes, and I write about whiteness because I want to belong to a community that has some kind of healthy practice of interrogating itself and its place in history. Because with that comes a set of insights about responsibilities for the future. I find geology very helpful, incidentally. I write a lot about rocks because they help to elasticize time, and they make human history very, very relevant, and actually quite a bit more accessible. Thanks. We'll pass it to Adrienne.
Yeah, thanks, Corinna. So yeah, why is most nature writing done by white people? Well, that's a big question, and I will certainly provide an imperfect response. But I think clearly the reason is most outdoors people are white people, and why is that? And before I try to answer that question, I want to point out that there are many people of color who are engaged in outdoor activities and writing about the environment and the outdoors. They may be lesser known in white circles. James Mills wrote a book, The Adventure Gap, about his experiences being part of the first African-American attempted ascent of Denali, the highest mountain in North America. I'm currently reading a book right now by Dr. Carolyn Finney called Black Faces, White Spaces, that looks at people of color and their relationship with the out of doors. And I would probably consider a lot of memoirs by Indigenous people a form of nature writing, just given the strong cultural connection between what we consider nature or the environment and them. So there are obviously many people accomplished at both. Certainly, though, the statistics show that most visitors right now to our public protected areas like national parks and wilderness areas and national forests are white. I happen to work for the National Park Service. I think the latest statistic is like 95% of visitors to national, what I read the other day, national forests and wilderness areas are white. And so why is that? Several reasons come to mind. First of all, some groups of non-white people have negative associations with, let's say, places like forests. For example, many Black people have a really negative association with forests due to the history of lynchings in forests, history with slave-related flights. Similarly, the word camps or camping can be really triggering for some Asian American populations with respect to internment camps. And then we need to look at who created these protected areas and for what purposes. And the answer is able-bodied, well-off white men created, we're behind the creation of our national parks, national forests, et cetera. And, many other groups of people didn't even have the right to vote, for example, when the National Park Service was established. And these places were largely created to provide a place for leisure activities for that demographic. It was also overlooked that these places were and continue to be the homelands of Indigenous people who were removed at best. And then finally, I think the conservation and outdoor recreation industries have tended to perpetuate this image of the white male in the outdoor environment. And you'll see very few images, for example, of people of color in advertisements, in outdoor publications. You'll see very few images of people of color in adventure films, depicted in magazines pertaining to outdoors and conservation, advertisements, all of that. So as we know, there are so many ways to value and connect with the natural world. And I suspect if we are primarily hearing the perspective of white people and the way that I can say we, value and connect with the natural world, we are missing out on a broader perspective. I do think that this is changing. And as we see more people of color engaged in outdoor activities, we'll see more people of color writing about it.
Thank you, Adrienne and Corinna. That was wonderful. I'm just going to add one thing. There's a guy by the name of J. Drew Lanham who wrote an essay called Birding While Black, which I think you can find online. And it comes from an essay collection whose name escapes me right now, unfortunately. But yeah, all the historical, constructs that you bring up really create difficulty for that. Yeah. Okay, I'm going to move on to the next question. And this one is for Nancy and me. And this one's on activism. The question is, what is the connection between writing about the natural world and taking action to protect it? Do people who write about wild places and creatures have an obligation to work to protect them? And Nancy?
Yeah, thanks, Marybeth. So, friend of mine, Mavis Muller, kind of coined a phrase called artivist that applies to artists and writers who use their work for change or to try to enact change. And so I guess I place myself there. I guess, any of us who write are driven by, both curiosity and some sort of passion. And so it's hard to separate. Oops, I'm getting an unstable message. So I hope you can hear me.
We can hear you.
It's hard to separate the writing, I think, from the activism. Okay, now. But I guess last week I heard speak in people who have written about climate change, and it really kind of brought it home to me. He had been a journalist, and he wrote The End of Nature in 1989, and he was talking about that he always saw himself as a journalist, and he thought that as a journalist, all he needed to do really was tell the story, and that was his job. That was enough, and then it was up to the policy people and everyone else to take that information and act on it. And he discovered after writing End of Nature that that wasn't happening. So he created 350.org as an activist organization that's been really effective in working on climate change issues. So he is just sort of my hero and my template of someone. But it's always a balancing between the time you have, limited time, the time that you spend on your writing and the time that you spend being active in other ways. So I guess I've been thinking of Marybeth, and I hope that you might add to this too, but it was in 2017 that Marybeth and I were at a conference in Washington, D.C., and it was right after Donald Trump had been inaugurated, and she and I stayed after the conference for a day on Capitol Hill and went and talked to Lisa Murkowski, and then the staffs of our other two people there in DC to really bring our concerns about the environment and our fears about Donald Trump to them. And that's just an example. So yeah, so I guess, but I guess I go back to what, do best is obviously not talk. So what I can do best is write. And so I think, we all bring what we can do to the world and do what we can through whatever our skill sets are. And so I feel, pretty okay about doing what I can as a writer, and sometimes stepping back from being as, doing the other things that I feel like someone needs to be doing. Doesn't always need to be me. So back to you, Marybeth.
Thanks, Nancy. Yeah, I was just thinking about our time in DC. I wrote a letter to the editor about our congressman and our experience in his office there and my support for Elise Galvin. So yeah, activism in writing. It's always been a tension for me. I've thought about it a lot. It's like, do I write or do I rally, or write a letter to the editor or, volunteer cleaning beaches or whatever. There's always so much to do. And, I'm going to go back to like why I became a writer and why I am who I am. And that is when I was a little kid when the first Earth Day happened. And I remember thinking, oh, the Earth needs me. This is a reciprocal relationship. It's not just I take and take and take. It's like, goes both ways. And so that just really like lit me up. And then in college, and I was studying environmental sciences, I thought, oh, wow, the written word really has power. Stories really have power. Look what the Monkey Wrench game did. Look what Silent Spring did. So that's when I decided to become a writer. So, and as I write and I do research and, we do a lot of research as writers, we learn more and more about these places and from our experience there and from things we learn about jellyfish and geology and everything. And then we learn more about what's going wrong and what needs action. And so it's a big tension. And I feel like my life is a gift so that I need to give something back in gratitude. One of my favorite writers and activists, Rick Bass, wrote about this a long time ago. And he said, well, it depends. If your house is on fire, you don't sit there writing a poem, you throw water on the fire. But right now, our house is on fire. Our whole planet is on fire. So fortunately, there are a lot of hours in the day. And so I do both. And for the past couple months, I've been writing poems in the morning and postcards to voters in the afternoon. We can do both. But I will also say that writing is activism, as Nancy has said. And I know that writing has power. And so even though I can't see it as quickly as I can, perhaps some of the other actions, I know that it does have an impact and has perhaps an even deeper and lasting change because it changes not just our minds, but our hearts and how we see ourselves in the world. I'm going to end with a quote from the late, great Grace Paley, who was an incredible short story writer, not a nature writer, but nonetheless a justice writer. She was asked this question, a similar question, do writers have a moral obligation? And she said, oh, I think all human beings do. So if all human beings have it, then writers have some too. I mean, why should they get off the hook? Whatever your calling is, whether it's as a plumber or as an artist, you have to make sure there's a little more justice in the world when you leave it than when you found it. Most writers do that naturally, see that more lives are illuminated, try to understand what is not understood, and see what hasn't been seen. So thank you, Grace. All right, now we are ready for some some questions from the audience, correct, Corinna? Am I following the format here? Okay, good.
I have copied, pasted 2 questions from the chat so far. Marybeth, do you happen to have those in front of you, or should I give you 10 seconds off? And how about I'll read the first question.
That'd be great.
And give you a second to scroll.
Thanks.
Crystal asks us, she makes a comment about Nancy's writing and how she tackled the violent, viscous part of nature where animals are dying constantly. And the question is, for the others, how have you seen that in your experience, and how has it impacted your writing? In other words, that violent, viscous part of nature, how has that in particular impacted your writing? Shall I bounce that question to Marybeth and Adrienne first?
I'm sorry, can you hear me now? Internet keeps putting and coming back. So I think I'm back now.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay. I'm not
back.
I guess am I back?
Mm-hmm.
I'm not seeing any of you. Say yes if I'm back.
Yes, we can hear you. Yes.
Okay. I guess I'm unaware that I've written very much about the violent side of nature, maybe other than killing fish. But I guess my answer would be that.
We lost her again. Can anyone else hear her? Okay, I'm going to keep going because I think Nancy's having some issues here. I'm going to go ahead and give a little answer.
I'm sorry, I keep.
Go ahead and give a little answer, and then we'll move on to Adrienne. So when I wrote The Heart of the Sound, which was the primary event of that book, is the Exxon Valdez oil spill of 1989, in which there was a lot of death of animals and a lot of horrible things that I saw and couldn't do much about. I was so exhausted after writing that I thought, you know, I just want to write about beauty. I just don't want to write about this awful stuff anymore. But, you know, it turns out that, you know, you can't have one without the other. You can't have beauty without terror. You can't have joy without grief. So that is just part of the deal. It's like Aldo Leopold said, you know, being environmentally aware means that you're walking in a world of wounds. You're always aware. The more you know, the more you know. So I do include that, and it's really, really hard for me to include that in my writing. In the book Among Wolves, which I co-authored with the late Gordon Haber after his death, I spent a lot of time going through his journals and pulling out pieces to include in the book. And there was one that every time I read it, typed it in, edited it, every single time I cried. And I did read it a few times in readings, but even that was really hard. And it was a scene where wolves that were caught in traps were killed by state biologists through the predator control program. And the description of the reactions of the wolves. Anyhow, so it is very hard, but extremely important that we show the whole picture, the blood and guts and everything. So I'll leave it there. And Adrienne?
Yeah, sure. I don't recall writing about naturally occurring kind of violence, but I will gladly take on human caused violence toward nature as a form of protest and activism. And the most recent or kind of thing that comes to mind, actually, Marybeth, is predator control. And the state's intensive management law and killing wolves. So yeah, not afraid to take that on. But and also one thing that I've come to realize for myself is it's easy to have a really visceral, reaction and just want to tell people this is wrong. And I've come to realize, at least for myself, telling people they should change or should care, or even shaming, is really not a super effective tool. And instead showing, through our own personal experiences, how we're impacted, I've been a little more successful that way personally.
I'd like to speak to this question also very briefly. One of my more formative experiences happened, I think I was approximately 5. I got to see an eagle hunting, and it caught a river otter whale. A river otter pup out of the water, and there's a lot of blood in the snow. Really fascinating. But my dad took me back to that place day after day. It was about a week that we watched the river otter mama, like back and forth, shrieking, crying. She didn't have a pup. And the really important conversation that started at that point in my life was that, like, that eagle is a mother also. And that eagle had to feed her babies also. And so there's this quite complex interplay, I think, between what is a predator and what is a caretaker. And I'm very interested in the kinds of images and observations that come out of the natural world to help really trouble some of those categories for me.
Thanks, Corinna. I think this is the next question. Excuse me if I'm not seeing them in order, but it looks like Peter Porco asked a question about Druids. He says, I wonder what part of Druid culture and general Northern European forest culture echoes within the Caucasian elements that we see in movements to preserve non-peopled, sorry, my scrolling just messed up. Is the whiteness being referred to some kind of continuation of the anti-urban tribal life of the ancient world? That's an interesting question. Who would like to try that one? Corinna.
I can't speak perfectly directly to that question, but that question makes me very eager to share with you that there is a fantastic thinker named Danica Boyce. She's in Northern BC, and she has a podcast called Fair Folk, and it's about paganism. And what I got from Danica Boyce's work most recently that may be relevant to your question has to do with abundance paganism. Danica Boyce makes the argument that humans, all of us, that we have a very a super abundance of peace in our heritage and of peace in our ancestry. So Danica Boyce, who researches paganism, she sees long periods of repetitive labor done together, punctuated by times of relaxation, as really fundamental to our human inheritance. And the extent to which you see this as really a point of entry into the question that you're asking, that's open. But I did want to put that idea on the table because I thought perhaps it connects to what we're doing here. Yeah, maybe others have something too.
Thank you, Corinna. Does anyone else have anything they'd like to add to that? Adrienne or Nancy? Okay, I'm just going to move on then. The next question is from Kathleen Tarr, and this is a question for anyone. Is the experience of COVID-19 raising our consciousness about the natural world at all? Are there positive changes taking place in people's overall awareness about the importance of protecting the environment, etc.? Good question. I'm just going to say a little bit right away, and that is that we all do remember how this started, right? With the wet markets where animals were in cages in horrible conditions. And I don't feel like we're remembering that. When it first started, there were a lot of cool stories about, the goats coming back into the little town in Wales and, all these, the wildlife kind of like re-inhabiting areas because people weren't around, but I haven't seen those stories so much since, and I really haven't seen much about it. The only thing that I can say is that not this country, but a lot of other countries have what they call green strings on the COVID money that the governments are, using to help communities and people and industry. Green strings meaning more renewable energy and things like that, so that they're using this as an opportunity to push us out of our fossil fuel addiction. But not in this country. So anyhow, that's the one good thing that might be a long-term positive change. Anyone else?
I can just comment on that really briefly from kind of sitting in a land manager seat for a lot of hours a day. I think, first of all, we've all seen and experienced just the benefits of being in nature during stressful times, and seeing our friends and neighbors and families all over the globe turn to nature as a place for a lot of us that has continued to be open. And so the psychological, emotional health, physical health benefits of that, I think, are more obvious to people now more than ever in a lot of places. We have also obviously seen a corresponding increase in use of public lands as people tended to be more comfortable and able to leave their homes. And with that increase in use has come increase in impacts. And so that's been reported by the land management agencies across the country. Human waste and trash and graffiti and all kinds of things. And I think in the less accessible places, so most of Alaska, where we didn't have folks from outside coming in this summer, nature has been given a break from people, where, like, for example, on Denali, the mountaineering program was basically closed this year, so that we don't have a lot of high use places in Alaska, but that is one, and it got a break. And so I think it remains to be seen whether or not this increase in use and kind of broader recognition of benefits will actually translate into people taking action to protect the environment in the future. I haven't seen that happen yet, so.
Corinna, Nancy, you want to add anything?
I vote we go on with the questions because there
Okay.
are several more that are quite good.
Okay. The next one I have is from Susan Summer. Is that correct? Or am I missing one? I'll go ahead and ask it. If I missed one, we'll circle back around. This is a question for anyone, and this is from Susan Summer, who's the editor of Alaska Magazine. Writings about nature often focus on serious issues and can feel very heavy. What do you think is the role of humor when writing about with nature? Nancy.
Yeah, first of all, my internet keeps going in and out, so forgive me if I disappear here. But this is something I think about a lot because the stories are so negative and so heavy. So I think part of it is trying to find, some animal that's doing something funny, or just trying to find a small piece of humor among it all. But I also think that part of the solution is fiction. To mention Bill McKibben again, he wrote a very funny novel called Radio Free Vermont, about some sort of environmental activist. It's very, slapdash, over the top humor, but I found it very entertaining. And then I wrote a novel called PH, which I tried to instill with, humor, with, characters and a plot line that was maybe more enjoyable to read, and still sort of got my what I wanted to convey across. So that's just a couple of ideas, but it's a problem.
I'd like to jump in. I really appreciate that question, and I feel I should preface this by saying I know nothing about humor writing, and I feel that I have a pretty good sense of humor as a human in the world, but I don't think I've ever written something funny in my life. I don't know how to do it, but I do see your comment about writing that's engaged in the out of doors is often being quite serious and being quite heavy. I think that's a good observation, but I also think that writing that's really integrated in our more than human world, to me, actually, that alone brings it quite a bit of levity. I have a great deal of despair when I am specifically only reading today's news items, but I feel really quite opened by the strange way that the moon keeps going through its cycle. That is wild to me, and it's continuous and it's transformative. And I think that's always happening in writing that's engaged with nature, and with our more than human communities and these powerful natural processes of transformation around us. I really find solace in that. And I also think that this is a good time for me to mention this book by Tommy Pico called Nature Poem. Tommy Pico is a member of the Kumeyaay Nation in Southern California. And this is a work about why he, as an Indigenous man, cannot write a nature poem. It's quite humorous. And I think part of what's so funny about Tommy Pico's addressing the stereotypes with Indigenous people that to him make, the nature poem a really inaccessible genre, although he writes one. I think what he's doing with nature there is really similar to or what he's doing with humor there is really similar to what Shakespeare's doing with humor, right? Like there's nothing so tragic as the comedies. And that's all I've got.
That's great, Corinna. Thanks. And thanks, Nancy. Yeah, your novel and its humor. It's wonderful. The next question I see is from Amarok Weiss, who is a wolf biologist with CBD. I know a lot of these people. It's so cool. Amarok asks, I would love to hear from each of you as nature writers, who you think of as your audience when you write. And if you change your idea of who your audience is with each new piece or new book you write, and if your idea of who your audience is has evolved as you have been writing over the years, and how have you decided who your audience is?
I can start things off if you like, since it was to everybody. What great questions. For me though, I write to no audience first, because I don't want kind of the judgment from what I'm perceiving as an audience to steer the work. So at first I just write for myself. And then my audience changes in my mind, depending on the project. And so for kind of my coming of age memoir, moving to Alaska, finding meaning, I was really trying to write that as a way to, perhaps inspire younger or middle-aged women making on the brink of making big decisions, things like that. The current work that is in progress about grief and resilience, I think of people who have lost someone very dear. And I think the bottom line for my audience that I envision is I'm writing to someone who I believe is going through something similar to myself. And my work is simply an arm extended to connect to that person, to make them feel less alone.
Thanks, Adrienne. Corinna, did you have something you wanted to add?
I'd echo Adrienne and say that I don't write for an audience. It's a very short comment. I can't envision any audience whatsoever ever reading my work. And I suppose if there is ever an audience, I can imagine no audience other than an audience that that is curious and that has time and space for slow questions.
Thanks. Yeah, I'm going to echo that too. I think of a quote that's been attributed to a lot of different writers, including Erica Jong, who wrote The Fear of Flying. How can I know who I am until I see what I write? Or how can I know what I think until I see what I write? I usually start a piece not knowing where it's going, and I think that's important. Who was it? E.M. Forster, who said, no surprise for the writer, no surprise for the reader. If you know where you're going, it's going to not be very interesting getting there. So I don't know where I'm going. I'm not, it's just like there's like an impulse that this is important. And then you just kind of go for it. And I just don't think about anyone reading it. Because as Adrienne said, it can shut you down too. It's like the editor comes on in your head and starts yakking at you. So we don't want that. Nancy, anything to add?
Yeah, Corinna used the word curiosity, and that's where I was going with it as well. That I figure my audience is people who are curious about similar things that I'm curious about, and I'm able to sort of take them into exploring those particular aspects of whatever. So that's as far as it goes for me.
I have a question that I passed over in my scrolling here, so I apologize to Shauna. She asked a question for Adrienne. You provided a great overview of how we, the collective we, have come to the predominant understanding or representation of wilderness. Can you speak to the work that is going on currently that might not be seen to address this perspective?
Sorry, I'm not sure I understood the question. Can you?
I'll read it again, yeah. You provided a great overview of how we, the collective we, have come to a predominant understanding or representation of wilderness. Can you speak to the work that is going on currently that might not be seen to address this perspective? So,
Shauna, could you clarify the question? I'm sorry, I'm not understanding what's being asked.
Yeah, no problem. So I know we were talking a lot about basically how wilderness doesn't seem very inclusive at this point. And so I'm just wondering if you can speak to, we know that there's a lot of groups out there who are really trying to forge ways ahead and make the connection for inclusion in wilderness. And I know that there's just a lot of work behind the scenes that people probably don't realize are happening. And I wonder if you could speak to that a little bit. Kind of goes back to hope.
Yeah, absolutely. There have been and continue to be so many nonprofits and organizations who work tirelessly to facilitate connections with nature and to kind of the non-white able-bodied male. So incredible work being done by, Latino Outdoors and on, people working with a kind of affinity groups, meaning people who can feel safe and supported, and who may have otherwise experienced a lot of barriers based on their identities. So people who are disabled, people of different races, people of different sexual orientations, on and on. And so there is a tremendous amount of incredible work and effort being done to do that. There are a lot of people who are trying to amplify the stories of people more diverse than the typical kind of white male, and a lot of people really thinking hard about how we can bridge some of the values that are shared among this kind of white European idea of wilderness. And for example, indigenous views, perspectives on wilderness, and there's a tremendous amount of overlap, I think, with regards to valuing this idea of humility and restraint and interconnectedness, and leaving a bequest to our children for the future. And so I think there's a lot more exploration to do there, trying to bridge those values and find the common values.
thank you, Adrienne. Well, folks, we've gone over it's about 7:20 now. I think some people have already signed off, but I think we'll bring it to a close now. Really great questions. That was really wonderful to have such a good discussion afterwards. And I encourage you all to continue these conversations and to please check out all of our writings: Corinna Cook, Marybeth Holleman, Nancy Lord, Adrienne Lindholm. We really appreciate you joining us tonight, and have a wonderful rest of your evening. Bye-bye.